Hello, my name's Nellist. I'm a Professor of Materials Science at the University of Oxford, Department of Materials, and I'm a former President of the Royal Microscopical Society. It's an absolute honour to introduce you to Professor Sir Peter Hirsch, Fellow of the Royal Society and Honorary Fellow of the Royal Microscopical Society. He's a winner of numerous international awards and medals, including the Wolf Prize for Physics, and he was head of the Department of Materials at Oxford for 26 years. Peter pioneered the application of transmission electron microscopy to metals and alloys and led the development of the theory which allows us to interpret such images. And today I'm here at Sir Peter's house, and we're going to discuss these developments which establish TEM as a key tool in materials science. I should start by mentioning that I'm sure that Peter's early life will be of interest to many of you. He is a Jewish refugee from Nazi Germany, travelling to the UK in 1938 as part of the Kindertransport. We're not planning to discuss his early life today, but for those of you who are interested, Peter discussed the scattering of his family at that time in a lecture to the Oxford University Shabbat Society, which can be found online. So Peter, you started your research career in the Cavendish Laboratory in Cambridge, and it was there you first accessed transmission electron microscopes, or TEMs. Could you just explain why you became interested in using a TEM?
Well, I graduated in 1946 in the Cavendish. I had read physics, Part 2 physics. And then I wanted to do research, and I got into the crystallography department, which at that time was headed by W.H. Taylor. And but the actual project given to me was given by Lawrence Bragg, the chap who invented the Bragg law.
W.L. Bragg,
yes, W.L. Bragg, who was head of department. And at the time, Bragg was interested in the deformation of metals and work hardening, and also he was also interested in dislocations. Now, at about that time, there was an enormous amount of activity by the solid-state physicists in the development of dislocation theory.
Yeah. Could you briefly just tell us what a dislocation is for those who are...
I've got a picture.
Yeah.
Of what a dislocation is and what it does. And this is called an edge dislocation, and it's characterized by an extra half plane of atoms terminating in the crystal, and you get distortions around it. And these dislocations move by one atomic plane after another, and eventually come to the surface and produce a step, and therefore change the shape of the crystal, and so the dislocation produces the plastic deformation by this slip method. There are all sorts of other dislocations. This is not the only one, and there's a particular one called the screw dislocations, which is turns out to be rather important in a little film which I'm going to show you later on. So these solid-state physicists developed the theory of these dislocations in great detail, and they invented any number of models to explain any mechanical properties you can think of, usually in several different ways. And it was perfectly obvious that what was needed was an experimental technique. There is, in fact, a rather famous quotation by W.T. Reed, who wrote a book called Dislocations in Crystals, published in 1954, which you can see that it became the fashion to invent a dislocation theory for almost every experimental result in plastic deformation, and it became apparent that dislocations could explain not only any result, but virtually any conceivable result, usually in different ways. So what was needed was an experimental technique. And
so would it be fair to say then that really talking about metal plasticity, that it was quite controversial and there was very little really understood about why metals were so ductile?
oh, absolutely. I mean, G.I. Taylor had as I suppose was earlier, produced a model of deformation of metals by dislocation. The dislocations themselves, a mathematical model, had been developed earlier than that. But what was needed was an experimental technique to be able to differentiate between all these wretched models which were thought of by the theoretical physicists. And I should explain that the metallurgists were extremely skeptical because they thought this was just a figment of imagination of all these theoretical physicists. There were ways in which you could see dislocations in inverted commas. For example, by edge pitting the surfaces where in fact dislocations came to the surface, the additional strain caused edge pitting, and then you could see rows of edge pits, and they were interpreted as sets of dislocations coming to the surface. And the other way also was it was possible in materials in which you could look through them, like silver chloride or where you could look through silicon in the infrared. There was a very famous picture by somebody called Dash showing the operation of a Frank Reed source, and the dislocations there were identified by there was a copper impurity in the material, and the copper precipitated on the dislocation. But you can see from this that the experimental evidence was very sparse
and indirect,
and surface observations in particular were a bit problematic. And I remember going to a conference organized by the Institute of Metals. I think it was in Exeter, in which an eminent metallurgist got up and gave a lecture on showing a lot of slides and discussing these slides, what they all meant. And after showing about 6 slides and talking to them, he said, "This is the wrong box of slides. It's not my slides," which suggested to me that surface observations weren't very discriminatory, not very reliable. So, if possible, some technique in which you could actually see them inside the crystal would be nice. Right about the same time, which was about 1949 or 1950, there appeared in the literature a transmission electron micrograph by Heidenreich at Bell
which
Telephone.
we're looking at now, yes.
A telephone.
Yeah.
And it was a TEM micrograph of subgrains in beaten aluminium foil. And that's essentially how we got into electron microscopy of deformed metals. Well, in 1954, Bragg had retired, and or rather, he left the headship of the Cavendish and went to London, and Neville Mott became head of department, and he was very interested in dislocations. And I suggested to him that maybe one could actually see them by transmission microscopy. And he supported me and that led to my actually getting a research student to work on this project. Well, the other thing that happened was that around that time, there was a new generation of electron microscopes which came along.
Peter, could you just explain how we can actually see dislocations in a transmission electron microscope?
Yeah, well, you can see it in different ways. This picture shows how contrast is produced in the electron microscope. The first one on the left is what's called a bright field contrast, where you get an image of the direct beam, which is on a photographic plate or other medium which is sensitive to the electrons. And then the next one it gives you dark field contrast, where you get the image from the diffracted beam. And the third one is an image which you produce by interference of many diffracted beams, and that enables you, in principle, to actually see the structures of the crystal, provided you have enough resolution. That is the technique which in fact, Jim Mentor used in 1956, and that's shown in the slide. And he managed to do this, to see an edge dislocation, the terminating atomic plane characterizing the edge dislocation in platinum phthalocyanine, where the spacing of the planes was about 1.2 nanometers or 12 angstroms. And the resolution of the microscope was just about enough to resolve these planes. But of course, if you wanted to see dislocations in metals, then you had to have resolutions of the order of 1 or 2 angstroms, because that would be the typical spacings of the planes. Now, I should explain that in addition to actually imaging the dislocation directly by imaging the crystal structure, which is what Jim Mentor attempted to do and managed to do in some way in platinum phthalocyanine, it is possible in principle to see the dislocation as a result of the strain field which it generates. And if you look at the fourth image on this composite slide, if you organize the orientation of the incident beam such that it's at the Bragg angle of the bent planes around the dislocation, then you can get a strong diffracted beam. And if you get the image of that, you will get an image, a dark field image of strong intensity. And the important thing about this is that the distances over which you would get a strong diffraction extended over many more atoms than just the interatomic distance, and that meant you didn't have to have an atomic resolution microscope to show the dislocation. And that system is called diffraction contrast. And that became the workhorse, if you like, of how to observe dislocations before it became possible to have microscopes with sufficient resolution to actually see the dislocations by their atomic structure. And what happened also at that time, which was about 1954, is that a new generation of electron microscope arrived, and it was a Siemens-Elmescorp, Siemens-Elmescorp, which is shown in this slide. And incidentally, you can see on this slide, well, two things. First of all, I should explain that this microscope was constructed like a battleship. It was absolutely solid. But you can see next to it, you can see a camera set up. And the reason for setting up that camera was that I'm going to show you a film in a moment of actually moving of the movement of dislocations, which was recorded as a film. But before I get that, I want to go back to this picture of how to get the strong contrast in the diffracted beam, because what I was talking about was the contrast in the diffracted beam, but what we were interested in was the images. And in fact, you can show that if you look at the diffracted beam, you find that most of the intensity at the of the diffracted beam comes from a very narrow region of a column along the diffracted beam. And that led to what was called the column approximation, that effectively you see an image if you like, the projection of whatever of this column, contrast in this column. It produces an image.
So can I just ask, who was actually doing the experiments?
Well, the experiments
what was your
but
your
I should
part?
explain that I recruited a research student, encouraged by Neville Mott, and I got Mike Whelan to join me as a research student in 1954. And that was crucial because he was tremendous. I mean, I couldn't have wished for a better research student. He worked all day and night, particularly at night, because that's when there was less disturbance for his experiments, which also had unfortunate side effects, like phoning me up at 3 o'clock in the morning to ask me, have I got a reprint of something? Well, anyway,
and were you allowed near the microscope?
Well, that's a very good question. The answer is no. I mean, the way the thing was operated was as follows. The instrument was in Kozlet's group. Kozlet was the head of there was an electron microscope group in the Cavendish, and it was headed by Ellis Kozlet, and they worked mainly on scattering cross-sections from various atoms, and they tended to use amorphous materials to do that. But he got a delivery of one of the first of these Siemens-Elmescorps, and after a certain amount of negotiations, we got some time on it, on condition that Bob Horn, who was one of the members of his group, was there to essentially supervise us. And most of the time, well, part of the time you operated the microscope. And and in about the end of 1954, end of 1955, Mike Whelan got some pictures of beaten aluminium foil yet again, you asked me what my job was. I wasn't allowed to operate the microscope. They were also terrified that I would mess it up in some way or other, but I was allowed to operate the stereo holder. We didn't have a goniometer stage. That was totally unknown in those days, because you have to remember that those microscopes were really designed for biologists, yes, not for material scientists. Well, this picture is a typical picture of the kind of arrangement of spots that Mike Whelan saw towards the end of 1955. And the spacing of the spots correlated extremely well with Frank's formula of the misorientation across the subboundaries.
So this is dislocations accommodating a twist boundary between two...
Well, a tilt boundary.
This is a tilt.
It would be a tilt boundary.
Between two crystals.
Yes. Yeah. And so we thought, well, jolly good, that shows that there probably are dislocations because it fits Frank's formula. And then unfortunately we realized that there was an alternative interpretation, and that these were moire patterns of overlapping crystals, and we were very careful about that. We were worried, and then what happened on one occasion, I suppose by this time it must have been in 1956, early 1956. Bob Horn decided to set this thing up in a mode different from the ones which Mike Whelan and I insisted on. And I should explain that since we were always interested in correlating the images with diffraction patterns, we insisted on the microscope being operated in a mode in which you could switch from microscopy to diffraction patterns.
Because you had come from a diffraction background.
Yeah.
So presumably initially you were interested in the diffraction, perhaps, where you would...
Well, we were crystallographers. Yeah. I came from the diffraction background, and we wouldn't believe any image unless, in fact, it was accompanied by a diffraction pattern. And unfortunately, the Elmiscope, the operation of the Elmiscope was such that although it had this novel feature of a double condenser lens, if you wanted to operate the microscope in a mode in which you could switch easily from microscopy to diffraction, you couldn't use the double condenser lens. The power pack was needed for operating some other lens to get the diffraction patterns. That was again because it was designed for biologists, not for material scientists. Anyway, Bob Horn, who had biological background, and he was more interested in microscopy, he wasn't interested in diffraction, set the thing up for the optimum microscopy setup, which involved the operation of the double condenser lens. And when we turned up, he'd set the thing up like this, and then he pulled out the when he opened up the condenser aperture, and lo and behold, all those lines and spots started moving all over the place, and it became perfectly obvious that they were dislocations. We were very lucky in that there was something most unexpected happened. And when the dislocations moved, they actually left traces on the images of where they had gone. And the next slide shows you actually two subsequent exposures of beaten aluminium foil by diffraction contrast. And you could see that there's been a movement of a dislocation between these two pictures, and it's shown up by this this contrast in the form of a bend going around the corner in the second slide, and that is in fact the trace of a screw dislocation inclined to the plane of the foil, moving from one plane to another. It's called cross-slip, and that's an immediate validation, if you like, of one of the proposals made by the theoretical physicists that you'd get cross-slip, and here you are.
Oh, so it had been predicted?
Absolutely, it was predicted, and here you are, you can actually see it. And you can also see on this picture a cross-grid of dislocations, and that corresponds to a twist boundary parallel to the plane of the foil between two grains. Well, I'm going to show you in a minute a film in which you can see the moving dislocations. But before I do this, I want to show you another slide, because around about that time, a little bit later, but not much than our publication, there was a publication by Bollmann in Switzerland, in Zurich, of these spotty lines, which you can see on this picture, which were interpreted as dislocation lines crossing inclined to the plane of the foil, and the material he was using was in fact stainless steel. And
in a minute, I want to just ask you why they're not lines, because they appear to be dotted.
Yes,
but before I do so, actually, were you aware of Bollmann's work, and was there a race to
we had no idea
publish
of
beforehand,
Bollmann's work at all. It turned out subsequently that the idea was suggested to him by an eminent French metallurgist called Crussard, well known in France. Because Bollmann was actually trained as a nuclear physicist, believe it or not. But when he got his PhD, question was, what was he going to do next? And Crussard suggested, well, why don't you try and see whether you can see dislocations? So there we go.
But you got published first, though.
What?
You got published.
Oh, yeah, we got published first. And although there's something very interesting in our publication, and that is, if you look at the paper which was published in 1956 in Film Mag.
That's Philosophical Magazine.
Yes. What was very unusual was that the paper was submitted in June 1956, and it was published in July 1956, which was unprecedented. But that wasn't because anybody knew about Bollmann's work, which was actually published in Phys Rev a few months later. That was to do with Film Mag not having enough papers at the time for publication. Yes. Why were these lines spotty? And to understand that, we have a look at the next slide. And if you look at the propagation of the electrons in a crystalline material, you'll find that the beam oscillates. If you are at the Bragg diffraction, you get a diffracted beam. The intensity oscillates with depth. And that's also reflected in the direct wave, of course, correspondingly. And if you now have a line like AB, if you think of that as a line lying across, and you're looking you're looking by this column approximation along the diffracted beam direction, you get oscillating contrast, and at certain points where the diffracted beam is actually zero, you will see nothing, and that is at least no change. And so you get oscillating contrast, which is what he saw. Well, while I've got this slide on, I should also say that suppose instead of having a dislocation, you have a stacking fault running across it. When the electron beam actually traverses the stacking fault, there's a phase change because the atoms on the two sides of the stacking faults are in the wrong order, and that leads to a change of phase in the diffracted beam. And that gives you contrast. And that will be also an oscillating contrast depending on the oscillations of the diffracted beam. I'll show you an example of that in stainless steel in a few minutes. But at this point, I should say that initially, instead of looking at beaten aluminium foil, we actually looked at beaten gold foil. Now, you might say, why did we look at beaten gold foil? And the answer to that is because you could buy it in a very, very thin form, like a gold leaf, from Messrs. George Wiley and Company, who produce these things.
So I suppose at that stage, really, there wasn't the understanding of sample preparation.
What?
There wasn't the understanding of sample preparation.
Yeah, because there were always difficulties about making samples thin enough.
Yep.
And we thought, oh, well, this was an easy way of doing it.
Were you aware that dislocations, or theories that said that dislocations could separate into partials?
Well, that was the next thing I was going to say, that Heidenreich and Shockley put forward a mechanism in which the dislocations in face-centered cubic metals actually split into two, what you might call, partial dislocations they're called, with a stacking fault in between, which led to a lowering of the energy of the system. And we wondered whether we would be able to actually see the dislocations by this stacking fault contrast.
So, and was the thinking there that because you didn't have high resolution,
yes,
that this was a larger object?
Yes. If the dissociations was significant, that you didn't need the high resolution. Well, in fact, Bollman was extremely expert at producing beautiful specimens of stainless steel by electropolishing. And so we collaborated with him, and he produced the specimens. And the next slide shows you, in fact, a number of exposures, a series of exposures of the same area, showing the movement of dissociated dislocations in stainless steel. These fringes you see here are in fact fringes produced by stacking faults. And in the picture labeled E, in the middle of the picture, you see what is effectively a dissociated dislocation. And you can identify it by the oscillations due to the contrast from the stacking faults. And then you found that the thing just expanded, and the first partial dislocation, it's called, went up to the grain boundary, and then the other one followed. And we saw a lot of this sort of movement. And now what all this showed us also was there was an enormous need for interpreting the diffraction contrast that you got of dislocations. And so we concentrated on developing the contrast, the diffraction contrast technique. And the next slide shows you this rapid development. And the first thing was the stacking faults, which contrast, the kinematical theory, which both Mike Whelan and I developed independently, and then the dynamical theory of the contrast from stacking faults, which Mike developed, which was in fact the first dynamical theory interpretation of a fault in a crystalline material.
And dynamical theory copes with multiple scattering.
Multiple scattering, and kinematical theory doesn't. Yeah. Kinematical theory, you assume that there is no re-scattering of the diffracted beam into the direct beam, whereas a dynamical theory takes into account all the coupling between the diffracted beams and the incident beam. And then the next thing that happened was the kinematical theory of dislocations, and the first thing that we started off, well, that was my leading it, was the kinematical theory of dislocations, and we published a paper which is full of amplitude phase diagrams, which I was very fond of. That was published in 1960. And in the meantime, Archie Howie had joined in 1957. There's a picture of him in the next slide.
And was Archie a research student?
Yes, he was a research student, at this stage, I can't remember whether he was my research student or Mike Whelan's research student, actually. But anyway, he may have been my research student. But what happened was that he and Mike Whelan collaborated in developing the dynamical theory of dislocation contrast. I was never keen on development of anything which required use of a computer. That was my problem.
And computers were available then?
There was a thing called ADSAC. I seem to remember they had to go to the engineering labs or to operate this wretched thing. Anyway, I mean, as as happened, when the kinematical theory was actually published in the Transactions of the Royal Society, which took a hell of a time, and it was published in 1960, and then it took another hell of a time for reprints to be sent to us. In those days, paper reprints were the form in which you got this stuff, and And I remember Archie presenting me with a copy of the kinematical theory of contrast of dislocations, and scribbled on the top of it, he said, "For historical interest only." And the reason was that by this time, he and Mike had developed the dynamical theory of dislocation contrast, which was published much more quickly in Film Mag. And they were the famous Howey and Whelan equations. Oh, there were all sorts of developments, absorption, and we were visited by Hashimoto, who was an eminent Japanese microscopist, and he joined us, and he was involved in the theory with which we introduced absorption. The importance of the diffraction contrast technique was that the resolution required to actually see all these dislocations was not atomic resolution, but a resolution of 10 or 20 angstroms would do fine. And these were resolutions which were available from existing electron microscopes like the Elmiscop, which we used. Maybe I just might comment at this stage that many of these dislocation mechanisms which had been proposed and promoted by the theoretical physicists were in fact confirmed. The theoreticians were pretty good at it, must say. But the observations only required really elasticity theory plus a knowledge of things like stacking faults. It did not require the subtle changes of positions of atoms around the core of dislocations. That the technique was not possible to do that.
But in developing these theories, do you think the background in crystallography and diffraction?
Well, it turned out, I believe, and I still stick to this opinion, it was absolutely vital and crucial that we were crystallographers and not metallurgists who were trying to develop this technique, because metallurgists on the whole weren't really all that interested in the fraction contrast, but we as physicists and crystallographers were absolutely interested in understanding the contrast. And that is why I think, because we were physicists and crystallographers, that the diffraction contrast technique was developed so quickly. But it also depended, of course, on having these excellent research students like Archie and Mike. Another interesting thing which came out of it really was the images that we got from the fraction contrast technique were three-dimensional. You got three-dimensional arrangements of dislocations, but all the theoretical models were two-dimensional, which was quite interesting.
Peter, I wonder, earlier on we saw a picture of the Elmiscop with this movie camera pointing down through one of the windows, the vacuum windows. Would this be a good time to look at...
do the film, yes.
To look at some of the movies,
yes,
and you can tell us what's going on. So this is the stainless steel, Peter. Could you tell us what's going on there?
Well, you can see the movement of dissociated dislocations in stainless steel along these along the slip lanes, as if they were moving along railway tracks. Incidentally, that spot in the middle, that dark spot, is a spot on the fluorescent screen. It's got nothing to do with dislocations. Well, you can see the movement of these dislocations in stainless steels. They move quite slowly, and every now and then the two partial dislocations expand more, and then they collapse again. And we'll compare them. We'll see that the motion is quite different from the motion of dislocations in aluminium, which you will see in a minute. Now, this is a bit of the motion of dislocations in aluminium. You can see that there's a boundary of dislocations there, and you'll see they suddenly all move, and they move in a completely different way. They move all over the place and go around corners. You can see that. And a lot of that is dislocations moving by cross-slip. And you didn't see any cross-slip in the stainless steel. And that's all got something to do with the stacking faults between the partial dislocations. You can see how the motion of the dislocations in aluminium is so totally different from that of the dislocations in stainless steel, and yet it's got the same lattice structure.
All to do with the different energies of the faults.
Yes.
So, Peter, a minute ago we were just talking about the development of the theory. I did just want to stop and pause and talk to you a little bit about what's known as the Yellow Bible.
Oh, yes.
Which is a reference book for many of us.
Well, what happened was that this diffraction contrast technique was really new to a lot of the metallurgical fraternity. I should make two comments here. One is that the film in particular convinced a lot of the metallurgists who previously had been skeptics of the dislocation mechanisms. It convinced them that was an important side effect, if you like, of the film and the observation of dislocations, that they really believed that they were of importance. The other thing is that we decided to have a summer school of in which we, in 1963, in which we had a series of lectures describing the diffraction contrast technique, mainly diffraction contrast technique, but more also on the observation of the operation of the instruments and so on. There was a whole series of lectures, and also how to take diffraction patterns and so on. That was an extremely successful summer school, and it led to the dissemination of this technique all over the world, because we had people come to this summer school from all over the place. And we decided, that was in 1963, and we decided that all the lectures were actually should be written up into a book, and that book was called the Yellow Bible.
Nicknamed the Yellow Bible.
What?
We should, of course, say that the actual title of the book was Electron Microscopy of Thin Crystals.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, it was transmission microscopy of crystals.
Electron Microscopy of Thin Crystals.
Of thin crystals.
The authors, and correct me if I get the order wrong here, was Hirsch, Howey, Whelan.
It was
Ashley,
alphabetical.
Ah, right.
It was alphabetical. Hirsch, Howey,
Nicholson, Pashley?
Nicholson, Pashley, and Whelan.
Right.
All the people who gave lectures.
Yes.
You know, and you can actually tell who wrote what, and I'm not going to go into that. If you look carefully into the book, you will find that most of the time, well, it was a question of how to write exponentials.
Oh.
Some of us wrote exponential in different ways, and you can tell the authors from this. Anyway, and the book was also very successful, and there were I think it was reprinted, and then and it was translated into various languages like Japanese and Chinese, I think, and Russian. Oh yes, it was translated into Russian. We never got any royalties from that. That was a point of annoyance. But anyway, it had a long lifetime. I think it is still being used.
It is available as, I think now, as a PDF.
Oh, is it?
Yes, the PDF version. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, there you are. It had a long lifetime. It has had.
You know, you made all these observations.
Well, it was.
What was the impact? What was the impact of those on the development of new alloys and mechanical properties understanding?
Yes, and I think I would yes. I think the technique was very important in giving you a technique for developing better alloys and understanding mechanisms. And I should say that I think that is still true. This technique is not obsolete, because the point about this diffraction technique is it does not depend on having dislocations along the direct beam. Okay.
Along the beam direction, yes,
beam,
end on.
Yeah, end on. You can see all the convolutions of these dislocations in 3 dimensions, and that is a technique which is established and used, and will be, continue to be used for the development of better metals and alloys.
There's another image. There's an image that I can see here of a deformed polycrystalline silver. What can we see in this image?
Yes, we can. The technique enabled you to get some insight into certainly the substructures and then the mechanisms which would lead to affect the mechanical properties. This slide shows a micrograph of polycrystalline silver heavily deformed, and you can recognize there are rather indistinct boundaries, but nevertheless you can see that these boundaries are going to be obstacles to a further slip and across the material. And leading to work hardening. You had to increase the stress in order to get any yielding.
Were there key applications? Were there technologies that were being developed which made use of this?
Well, there was, and I'll come to that in a second. Okay, and I'll before I do that. I want to show you an effect where you could see a direct effect between what happened to the material and the deformation and the defect structure, and that is quench hardening. If you look at if you consider a metal near the melting point, there is a much higher concentration of vacancies in thermodynamic equilibrium than there would be at room temperature. That's a question of entropy, really, disorder. And in this picture, shows you what would happen if you take such a material from near the melting point and quench it down to, say, room temperature. And what happens is that in order to get rid of these excess vacancies, they congregate into disks, which you can see in little c here, and this disk will then collapse to form a dislocation loop. And for face-centered cubic materials, there are two ways in which the collapse can take place. Because the stacking of these 111 planes, which are shown on this picture, are IBC, ABC. If they collapse straight down, then you got a stacking fault, because in the middle of this, A now is above C rather than above B, and that is a stacking fault, and this next slide shows you a picture of the stacking fault contrast you get from these collapsed loops after quenching. I think these are beautiful images.
Indeed, yes.
They are. Then they also show the crystallography
And
of
again,
the symmetry of.
And you can see the fringes of the
Yes,
inclined stacking faults that you predicted.
Absolutely. Mike Whelan with John Silcox did an experiment in which they made the specimen holder into a heating stage, and that effectively annealed the the materials. And what happened was that the loops gradually shrank, and they do this by emitting of vacancies, and the vacancies disappear at the surface, and eventually they disappear. And from the rate at which this happens, you can determine the activation energy of this process, which is in fact diffusion. And this shows that the electron microscope can be used not only just to show pretty pictures, but in fact also to use it as a lab, to do experiments on. And well, then the next slide shows you what structure you get if you had non-deformable particles like oxide particles in the material, and then you get these complicated structures, dislocation structures, and you can visualize that if you try and force another dislocation through, it will be difficult to do, and that leads to hardening. So that is an example of alloy hardening. Now, you asked me...
The mechanism of alloy hardening can now be understood and studied.
Yes, yes. Now, I think there is perhaps a word of warning, I should say, and it's this, that what the technique is very good at is looking at interactions between individuals, dislocations with each other, and with other obstacles like non-deformable particles or precipitates or whatever. And it's also good in certain cases, for simple cases, for the interaction between different dislocations. But the actual mechanical property is rather complicated generally, and it depends not only on these individual interactions, but on a many-body interaction that you have. And so it tends to be more complicated. But at least these pictures show you there are some elementary mechanisms which are involved. Now, at about the time, about this time, there wasn't quite a lot of activity about developing nuclear reactors. And one of the problems was that the pressure vessels in the pressurized water reactor became embrittled as a result of the damage by neutron irradiation. And this technique provided a means of actually studying what the nature of the damage was. And by some coincidence, the technique was developed just about the right time for it to be used. And this next picture shows you the sort of thing that you see in neutron irradiated copper. That was an important development and a great help in understanding what went on in producing damage in nuclear reactors.
So Peter, you know, we talked a lot about those early developments and really the first applications of transmission electron microscopy in materials science. I know you retired in 1992, but you've kept a very close eye on developments really since that time.
Well, there were a lot of important developments since 1956. There were some the developments in the diffraction contrast technique, like the so-called weak beam technique, and was also using computer simulation of the dislocation images which you saw. But one of the instrumental developments was the development of high voltage electron microscopes, and that was partly for better resolution, partly for better penetration, so you can look at thicker specimens. And it had the effect of a development of in situ straining holders, heating holders, cooling holders, and environmental cells, and that is in which you could study, for example, oxidation reactions and similar chemical reactions. If I could just say something about the current state of the art.
I mean, I'm probably interested in what you feel some of the more important developments are up to the current date.
Well, I think the most important developments were, I think, the development of the aberration corrector. The other important thing which happened was the development of the so-called Z-contrast technique. And now we'll go over to the STEM system, where you have an incident probe of diameter maybe an angstrom or so, which you can get down to by using an aberration corrector. And then you observe the scattering in an annular detector, the so-called Z contrast image, in which the different beams are in fact scattering incoherently. And you can also then send the beam into an EELS detector, an electron energy loss detector, so you can do a scan of the electron energy loss in the material. Show you an example or two. The next one actually shows a picture of a Z contrast image, incoherent image in a tilt boundary in silicon. And again, I mean, the resolution there to resolve in the grain boundary, and the resolution in the dumbbells is about 1.3 angstroms, which is a tenth of Menter's platinum salicyanide. And these pictures are really very, very impressive. I should say that the STEM, I suppose, was developed in for seeing individual atoms by Crew many, many years ago, but then not used because of the lack of resolution, really. And the next slide shows you a great effect of this STEM imaging, and that is the incoherent scattering you get is sensitive to the strength of the scattering of the atom column, and that means it's sensitive to the elements producing the contrast. And this shows, in fact, a beautiful picture of the embrittlement of copper grain boundaries by bismuth, which is of, I mean, the principle is of great importance in the embrittlement of grain boundaries in metallurgical applications. And there's another picture here of arsenic impurities in silicon grain boundaries. I'd just like to finish up with this picture of the evolution of resolution, which dates back to Abbe in 1800s, I suppose. And you can see that the rate at which the improvement has occurred over the years, and the last step, the development of the aberration correctors over the last 10 or 20 years. Well, there's a personal history of the effect of transmission microscopy in material science, and as regards prediction for the future, it's a question now of utilizing the technology it developed for looking at all sorts of specimens.
Peter, thank you very much indeed. It's wonderful to hear both the stories of the pioneering days of applying transmission electron microscopy in material science.
Yes.
As you say, at the time it wasn't really thought of that was going to be an important application of transmission electron microscopy. Now, of course, we know that it's a key technique in material science, and it's also been great to hear about your perspective on what the current state is and what the importance is going forward. So thank you again very much for that conversation.
Well, I enjoyed it. Thank you very much.
Thank you.